Love was for the young, for girls with smooth hands and unbroken dreams, not for a woman who had buried a husband and folded away her white dress 12 years ago. So when the bell above her shop door rang that morning, she did not look up with hope. She looked up with habit. And that was the moment everything changed. Margaret Hayes stood behind her counter, fingers resting on a half-finished hem. The thread trembled between her fingertips. She blamed it on age. Or coffee, not the sudden awareness that someone new stood in her doorway. He filled the entrance without trying to. Broad shoulders, dust on his boots, a worn leather hat turning slowly in his hands. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, calm, certain. She swallowed, forced herself steady. "What can I do for you?" He stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight. Sunlight framed him from behind, but she refused to let her mind wander toward poetry. She had outgrown poetry. Name's Daniel Mercer. Just bought the old Whitmore Ranch outside town. Heard you're the finest seamstress in Cedar Ridge. She gave a small snort. "I'm the only seamstress in Cedar Ridge." A corner of his mouth lifted. "Then I reckon that makes you the finest." He set a folded stack of shirts on the counter. Work shirts. Good cotton. Worn at the elbows. Torn at the cuffs. She reached for them. Their fingers brushed. He traveled up her arm like a spark catching dry grass. Ridiculous, she told herself. She was 47 years old. She had known love. She had lost it. That chapter was closed. Daniel watched her hands as she inspected the stitching, not in a way that made her shrink, in a way that made her feel seen. "You've got steady work here," he said, glancing around the shop. Dresses hung neatly along the wall. A wedding gown stood proudly on a wooden form near the window. She followed his gaze. "I keep busy. Busy keeps the mind quiet." He nodded once, as if he understood more than she said. "Lost my wife 6 years back," he offered gently. "Child, too." The air shifted. Margaret's throat tightened. She did not ask for details. Grief recognized grief, without explanation. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, just honest. She cleared her throat and folded one of his shirts. "I'll have these ready in 3 days. I'm in no hurry." He lingered another moment, studied her face. Not boldly, not foolishly. "You don't strike me as a woman who quit on things, Mrs. Hayes." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I don't." He nodded again, almost satisfied. "I'll see you in 3 days." When the door closed behind him, the bell gave one last small ring. She stood still, then pressed her palm flat against her chest. Her heart was racing like she had run a mile uphill. "Don't be foolish," she whispered. But 3 days later he returned. And 3 days after that, and again. Each time with shirts that barely needed mending, each time staying longer. He asked about fabrics, about patterns, about the lace on the wedding gowns. He listened, really listened. When she spoke about stitching by lamplight after her husband passed. When she spoke about building this shop alone. About the quiet evenings upstairs where silence pressed heavy against the walls. Daniel did not interrupt, did not rush to fill pauses. He just stayed. Spring melted into summer. He brought wildflowers once, said they reminded him of her, sturdy, unexpected, blooming where others would not. She laughed at that, then cried later when she was alone. The town began to notice. Women smiled at her a little differently. A few whispered, wondering what business a woman her age had laughing in the street beside a rancher. For the first time in years, she did not bow her head to gossip. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the shop window, Daniel set his hat on the counter and met her eyes. "I didn't think I'd feel anything again," he said. Her hands stilled. "Thought that part of me died with Sarah." He stepped closer. "But then I walked in here, saw you standing behind this counter like you'd built your own fortress from thread and willpower." Her breath caught. and something woke up. Margaret turned away quickly, began folding fabric that did not need folding. "Daniel, I am not a young woman." He moved beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him. "I see a woman who kept standing when life knocked her flat. I see strength. I see kindness. I see someone worth knowing." Tears threatened. She refused them. "I have gray in my hair, lines on my face, hands rough from work." He gently took one of those rough hands. These hands built something lasting. His thumb brushed her knuckles. "Age doesn't frighten me, Margaret. Losing the chance does." She finally looked at him, and what she saw was not a man chasing youth. She saw a mirror. Two people who had survived storms, two hearts cautious, beating anyway. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he said. The words hung between them like a fragile bridge. Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance. Inside, something shifted. And for the first time in 12 long years, Margaret Hayes allowed herself to wonder. What if love had been waiting for her all along? Daniel did not kiss her that day. He did not reach for her again. He simply let her hand rest in his for one more breath, then stepped back, slow, careful, as if he understood that rushing her would break something fragile. "I'll be at the ranch tomorrow afternoon," he said quietly, "fixing fence along the east pasture. If you feel like riding out. If you don't, I'll still be there." He tipped his hat and left. Margaret stood alone in the shop long after the door closed. Her hands still tingled. Afraid. She had spoken the word out loud. That alone felt dangerous. That night she lay in the small bedroom above the shop, staring at the ceiling beam she had memorized over 12 quiet years. The town settled into darkness below her. A dog barked once. Then silence. She turned onto her side. What was she doing? She had survived widowhood, survived loneliness, survived building a life from nothing but stubborn will and steady hands. Why risk that balance now? What if this was not love? What if it was only two lonely souls mistaking warmth for destiny? She closed her eyes and saw his face. Not handsome in the way young men were, but steady, kind, certain. She slept little. The next afternoon she surprised herself. She closed the shop early, something she had not done in over a decade. The ride to Whitmore Ranch felt longer than it should have. The prairie stretched wide and gold beneath the sun. Wind brushed her cheeks. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the horse beneath her. When she reached the fence line, Daniel was there, sleeves rolled, hands working wire through weathered posts. He looked up and stilled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he smiled. Not triumphant, relieved. "Thought maybe I'd imagined yesterday," he said. "You didn't," she replied. He walked toward her slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You look nervous." "I am." "Good," he said softly. "Means we're both honest." They walked along the pasture fence together, not touching, just close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. "You don't have to decide anything today," he told her. "I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" "A chance." The word lingered. They sat later on his porch as the sun lowered behind distant hills. He poured coffee from a tin pot. She noticed how carefully he set the cup in her hands. He told her about his wife, Sarah, about her laugh, about the child they never held long enough. He did not speak as a man still drowning. He spoke as a man who had learned to carry grief without letting it carry him. Margaret listened. Then she spoke of Thomas, of fever, of nights sitting beside a bed praying for breath that never came. Daniel did not offer platitudes. He simply took her hand again. They sat that way until the sky deepened to indigo. "I don't want to replace what we lost," he said quietly. "I don't want to erase it. Neither do I. I just don't want the rest of my life to be empty." Her throat tightened. "Mine already feels less empty," she admitted. That was the first time she allowed the truth to stand between them. Summer ripened around Cedar Ridge. Margaret found herself humming while she worked. She rode out on Sundays, helped him plant late vegetables behind the barn, laughed when he burned the biscuits, argued gently over whether blue or green suited Mrs. Dalton best. The town noticed. Some approved openly. Others whispered that romance at their age was foolish. Margaret heard it all. For the first time, it did not shrink her. One evening in late August, Daniel invited her for supper. He had set a small table on the porch. Candles flickered in the warm dusk. Roasted chicken, garden carrots, fresh bread still steaming. She felt like a young bride. Which terrified her. They ate slowly, talking of small things, of weather, of cattle prices, of thread shipments delayed by rain. Then Daniel grew quiet. "Margaret," he said, setting down his fork, "there's something I need to ask you." Her pulse began to pound. "I don't want your answer tonight," he continued. "I want you to think, sleep on it, turn it over in your mind from every angle." He stood, walked around the table, knelt. Her breath stopped. From his pocket he pulled a simple gold ring, smooth with age, warm in the candlelight. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said. "She wore it 52 years. Once told me love doesn't expire just because time passes." His voice trembled slightly. "Margaret Hayes, I love you." The words struck deep. "I love your stubborn strength. I love the way you speak to your thread when it tangles. I love that you kept going when it would have been easier to give up." Tears blurred her vision. "Will you marry me?" Silence fell. The night held its breath. She could not speak. Her chest ached with the weight of it. Daniel rose slowly. "Take your time," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." She rode home under a sky scattered with stars. Sleep did not come. Her mind built walls. Too old, too foolish. What if sickness returned? What if grief returned? What if she was risking the fragile peace she had built? But her heart offered images in return. Daniel bringing her coffee when she worked late. Daniel walking beside her through town without shame. Daniel looking at her as if she were treasure. By dawn, her answer had already formed. She just needed the courage to carry it. Margaret did not open the shop that morning. The sign on the door stayed dark. For 12 years, work had been her refuge, her shield, her excuse. Not today. She dressed slowly, brushed her silver-streaked hair with steady hands that did not feel steady at all. The mirror reflected a woman lined by time. Strong jaw, soft eyes. Too old, the mirror seemed to whisper. She lifted her chin. Or just in time. The ride to Whitmore Ranch felt different than the night before. The sky was pale blue. The air carried the scent of hay and sun-warmed earth. Her heart beat harder with every step of the horse. He was in the barn when she arrived, brushing down a chestnut mare. He turned at the sound of hoofbeats and stilled. She saw it instantly. Hope and fear, both fighting for ground inside his eyes. He set the brush down slowly, walked toward her without speaking. Not too fast, not too sure. Margaret stepped into the barn doorway. Dust floated in slanted beams of morning light. "I didn't sleep," she said. "Neither did I." Silence wrapped around them, thick as wool. "I thought about every sensible reason to say no," she continued. About gossip, about age, about the possibility of burying another husband. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She took a breath. "Then I thought about what my mother once told me." Daniel's eyes searched her face. She said love isn't about finding someone who makes life easier. It's about finding someone who makes life worth living. The barn felt suddenly very small. Margaret stepped closer. "You make my life worth living, Daniel Mercer." His breath caught. "If you're still willing to take me, gray hair and all, my answer is yes." For a heartbeat, he did not move. Then the sound that left him was half laugh, half broken sob. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Strong, certain, shaking. "I was prepared for no," he murmured into her hair. "So was I." He held her as if anchoring himself to solid ground, as if this moment might drift away if he loosened his grip. Outside, the mare stamped once in her stall. Life went on. But inside that barn, something sacred had begun. They married in October. The church at the edge of Cedar Ridge had never looked brighter. Crisp air, golden leaves skittering across the steps. The whole town gathered despite themselves. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn alone in the quiet hours of early dawn. Cream silk. Lace at the collar, sleeves long and graceful. Daniel wore a new black suit that fit him almost too well. He looked uncomfortable and proud. When she walked down the aisle, there were whispers, but they were not cruel. They were softened, moved. 2 souls in the autumn of life daring to bloom again. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her gently, reverently. The church erupted in applause. Margaret felt something lift from her shoulders, years of doubt, years of believing she was finished. That night, on the porch of their farmhouse, wrapped in a quilt she had stitched long before she imagined this life, Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. She leaned into him. "Happier than I thought I was allowed to be." "Allowed," he repeated softly. She nodded. "I wasted years thinking love had an age limit. That beauty expired." He turned her chin toward him. "You are beautiful, Margaret. Not because you're young, because you endured." Her eyes filled. "Strength doesn't mean standing alone," he added. "Sometimes it means letting someone hold you." She rested her head against his chest, and for the first time in decades, sleep came easy. The years that followed were steady and full. She moved her sewing table into the front room of the farmhouse. Women from 3 counties began traveling to Cedar Ridge, asking for dresses from the seamstress who had married in autumn and made it look like spring. Daniel's ranch prospered. They worked side by side. Shared coffee at sunrise, shared laughter at dusk. They argued sometimes, over fence posts, over fabric colors, over nothing at all. And then they laughed about it. One winter, they took in a quiet, orphaned girl named Eliza. Thin as a sapling, eyes too old for her years. Margaret taught her to sew. Daniel taught her to ride. The house filled with footsteps, with warmth, with purpose. On their 10th anniversary, Daniel handed her a leather-bound journal. "For your story," he said. "Write it all down." She traced the cover gently. Why? So one day, some woman sitting alone might read it and realize she's wrong about being too late. Margaret began writing that very night. She wrote about the bell above the shop door, about fear, about stubborn hope, about learning that grief and joy could live in the same heart. Time moved the way it always does, quietly, surely. When Margaret turned 73, her hair was nearly white, her hands slower, but her eyes still bright. One spring evening she lay down for rest. Daniel held her hand as he had so many nights before. Her breathing softened, faded, and slipped away like a sigh carried on wind. The town mourned. But Daniel found comfort in one truth. For 26 years, he had loved her, and she had loved him back. He opened her journal days later. On the final page, she had written a message. His hands trembled as he read. And when he reached the last line, his shoulders shook with quiet tears. But through the grief, a small smile touched his lips. Because even in death, she had left him something more powerful than sorrow. Daniel did not close the journal right away. He sat at the small kitchen table long after sunset, the lamp casting a soft circle of light over the worn leather cover. Outside, the ranch lay quiet. The wind brushed the porch boards. A loose hinge tapped once against the frame. He traced her handwriting with his thumb. Steady, certain, even at the end. "My dearest Daniel," she had written, "if you are reading this, then I have gone ahead to wait for you. But do not rush. Live your days fully. Love the life we built. Love our girl. And remember, it was never too late for us." He pressed the page to his chest. Never too late. For a long time, he had believed his life had ended the day Sarah died. He had walked through years like a man half awake, working, breathing, existing. Then, Margaret had opened a door he did not know still stood. And now, she was gone. The house felt larger without her. Too large. Eliza sat quietly across from him, grown now. A woman with strong shoulders and gentle hands. She reached across the table and covered his with her own. "She would not want you sitting in the dark," she said softly. He managed a small smile. No, she wouldn't. The next morning, he rose before dawn. Old habits. He brewed coffee the way she liked it. Strong, no sugar. He poured 2 cups before remembering. He stared at the second cup for a long moment, then carried it outside and poured it gently into the earth near the porch steps. "For you, Maggie," he whispered. Life did not stop. Cattle still needed tending. Fences still sagged. The garden still demanded care. And so he worked. He worked through grief the same way he had worked through loss before. But this time, something was different. He did not feel empty. He felt full. Full of memory. Full of warmth that did not vanish with her breath. The townsfolk came often in those first months, bringing pies, bringing quiet company, speaking softly of her laugh, of her dresses, of the way she made every bride feel beautiful, no matter her age. Daniel listened. He told stories too. About the morning she rode into his barn and said yes. About the way she hummed while sewing. About the stubborn crease in her brow when thread tangled. People began to speak of them together, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. Autumn returned to Cedar Ridge. The leaves burned gold again, just as they had the year they married. Daniel found himself walking to the small church one afternoon. He sat in the last pew, hat in hand. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the empty space beside him. Then he closed his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured. "Not for taking her, but for giving her." Years passed more quickly than he expected. His hair thinned. His hands stiffened in the mornings. Eliza married a kind rancher from the next county, and laughter filled the house once more when she visited with her own children. Daniel would sit on the porch at dusk, a quilt folded over his knees, the same quilt Margaret had sewn long ago. Sometimes he would open the journal again, read her words aloud to the fading light. Her story traveled farther than they ever imagined. Women from nearby towns would ask to see the journal. Some copied passages, some wept quietly as they read. It became something more than memory. It became hope. One evening, 5 years after her passing, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. Not pain, not fear, just stillness. He moved slowly through the house, touching the back of her old sewing chair, running his hand along the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals. He stepped onto the porch as the sky turned deep violet. Stars began to appear. He lowered himself into the rocking chair and wrapped the quilt around his shoulders. "Margaret," he said softly, "I've lived the days you asked me to live." A breeze stirred. He closed his eyes. For a moment he could almost feel her beside him, the warmth of her hand, the quiet strength of her presence. His breathing slowed. A faint smile touched his lips. And when the ranch hands found him the next morning, seated peacefully beneath the wide western sky, they said he looked like a man who had just seen something wonderful. The town buried him beside her. 2 simple stones. side by side. On quiet evenings, when the prairie wind moves gently through Cedar Ridge, some folks say they feel something rare in the air. Not sorrow, not longing, but warmth. The kind that comes from knowing love does not belong only to the young, it belongs to the brave, to those willing to risk one more beginning. And in Cedar Ridge, whenever someone whispers that they are too old for romance, too worn for dreams, someone else always answers gently. Tell that to Margaret and Daniel. Winter came hard the year after Daniel passed. Snow pressed against the windows of the farmhouse. Wind howled across the open prairie, rattling shutters Margaret herself had painted pale blue decades earlier. But inside, the hearth stayed warm. Eliza kept it that way. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, her children's laughter rising and falling like music in rooms that had once known only silence. She kept Margaret's sewing table near the front window, kept Daniel's boots by the door. Nothing felt abandoned, only remembered. On certain evenings after the children had gone to bed, Eliza would take down the leather-bound journal and sit beside the fire. She would open it carefully, reverently. The pages had softened with time. Margaret's handwriting curved across them steady and strong, as if the years had never frightened her at all. Eliza would read aloud, not loudly, just enough for the room to hear. She read about the bell above the shop door, about fear disguised as pride, about the afternoon in the barn when two broken hearts chose courage over comfort. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she smiled, and sometimes she simply closed her eyes and let the words settle deep inside her, because she understood something most people did not. Margaret had not just married Daniel. She had changed the town. Before them, Cedar Ridge had been a place where people endured, worked hard, survived winters, buried losses, moved forward without looking back. After them, something softened. Widowers began sitting beside widows at church instead of across the aisle. Hands that once trembled with hesitation found courage in simple conversation. One spring, a woman nearly 60 rode into town and asked Eliza if the stories were true. Did she really find love at 47? Eliza smiled gently. She found it at exactly the right time. The woman nodded slowly, then stayed in town longer than she had planned. The years folded quietly over one another. Margaret's dresses remained treasured heirlooms. Brides traveled from distant counties, still asking for patterns inspired by her early designs. Some even requested a small stitched tag inside the lining. M. Hayes Mercer. Eliza honored the request each time. Daniel's ranch continued under careful hands. His name carried respect, not because of wealth, but because of devotion. On the 20th anniversary of Margaret's passing, the town gathered at the small church once more. Not for mourning, for remembrance. The preacher spoke briefly, then stepped aside. Eliza stood before the congregation, journal in her hands. She turned to a page marked by a ribbon Daniel had once placed there. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. She wrote this on their 10th anniversary, Eliza said softly, for women who think the door has already closed. She began to read. Love does not measure your years. It does not ask how many winters you have endured. It asks only this: will you open the door when it knocks? A hush fell over the pews. Some wept quietly, others held hands, and somewhere in the back row, a widowed rancher glanced sideways at a schoolteacher who had worn black far too long. Hope moved like wind through dry grass, gentle, invisible, powerful. After the service, people walked together to the cemetery on the hill. Two simple stones rested side by side. Margaret Hayes Mercer, Daniel James Mercer, beloved. Eliza knelt and brushed away fallen leaves. I still hear you both, she whispered. In the wind, in the house, in my children's laughter. The prairie stretched wide and endless beyond the hill. Life continued, as it always does. Years later, when Eliza's hair began to silver at the temples, she found herself sitting alone one evening on the farmhouse porch. The sky glowed deep orange. The horizon burned like memory. She held the journal in her lap. She thought about the girl she had once been. Thin. Frightened. Unsure if she belonged anywhere. Margaret had given her more than shelter. She had given her proof. Proof that broken did not mean finished. Proof that love could arrive late and still last forever. Eliza opened to the final page, the one Daniel had read with trembling hands. My dearest Daniel. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the message had not. Eliza closed the book gently, and for the first time in her own life, she allowed herself to consider something she had quietly dismissed. Maybe her own story was not finished yet. The porch creaked softly beneath her. The evening wind stirred, and somewhere in the hush of twilight, it felt as though Margaret and Daniel were still watching over the land they had once called home. Not as ghosts, but as promise. A reminder that the heart does not close simply because years have passed. It waits, patiently, for one brave moment. Spring returned gently to Cedar Ridge the year Eliza turned 50. The orchard behind the farmhouse bloomed white and soft, petals drifting across the grass like quiet blessings. The ranch was smaller now, easier to manage. The house creaked more in winter, settled more in summer. But it still stood. So did she. Eliza had never thought much about her own heart. She had been busy raising children, burying her husband after a sudden fever, holding steady through seasons that tested her strength. She had loved once, deeply. And when that love ended, she folded it carefully away, just as Margaret once had. Life went on. Until one afternoon, the bell above the old dress shop door rang again. The shop had remained open all these years. Eliza kept it alive, not with Margaret's exact touch, but with reverence. She looked up from her sewing table. A man stood in the doorway, broad shoulders, silver at the temples. Hat turning slowly in his hands. For a moment, her breath stalled. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice carried dust and distance. "I was told there's still someone here who knows how to mend a proper ranch shirt." Eliza blinked. The room felt suddenly smaller. "You were told right," she replied. He stepped inside, removed his hat. "Name's Thomas Hale. Just moved in from up north. Bought the old Carver place." Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the shirts he laid on the counter. They brushed. Heat sparked. She nearly laughed. Not again. Not at this age. She had read the journal enough times to know how stories could begin. She had also lived long enough to know how they could end. "I don't mend as fast as I used to," she said carefully. "I'm in no hurry," he answered. The words echoed through her chest like something remembered. He lingered, asked about fabrics, about the history of the shop. His gaze drifted toward the framed photograph hanging by the window. Margaret and Daniel on their wedding day. "They look happy," he said. They were. She studied his face. "Widower?" she asked gently. He nodded once. 3 years now. Silence settled between them. Not heavy, just honest. Eliza felt something stir. Not reckless, not foolish, just alive. When he left, promising to return in 3 days, she stood in the doorway long after he disappeared down the street. The prairie wind lifted her hair. She pressed her hand to her chest. The heart still beats, she thought. That evening she carried the journal out to the porch, the same porch where Margaret once whispered yes, where Daniel once watched stars with quiet gratitude. She opened to the first page, read the words she knew by heart. She had already decided. Love was for the young. Eliza smiled softly. Not anymore. 3 days later, Thomas returned. And 3 days after that, he brought fresh apples from his orchard, stayed longer each visit, asked about her children, listened when she spoke of grief without flinching. The town noticed again. Whispers rose and faded like wind. But Cedar Ridge was not the same town it had been decades ago. It had learned. One evening, beneath a sky brushed in gold and violet, Thomas stood on the farmhouse porch holding something small in his hand. "I won't kneel," he said gently. "My knees aren't what they used to be," she laughed. "But I will ask." He opened his palm, a simple band, silver, unadorned. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I'm not asking to replace what you lost. I'm asking to share what time we have left." Her breath trembled. Fear flickered, then memory steadied her. Margaret's words echoed clear as church bells. "Will you open the door when it knocks?" Eliza stepped forward. "Yes," she said, not because she was certain, but because she was brave. The years that followed were not dramatic, not grand. They were steady. Shared mornings, shared coffee, shared quiet. And that was enough. On the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, 4 stones now stood. Margaret Hayes Mercer, Daniel James Mercer, Eliza Mercer Hale, Thomas Hale, side by side. The prairie wind still moves gently across that hill, and when young women whisper they are too late, or older women sigh that their time has passed, someone always tells them about the seamstress who believed she was finished at 47, and the cowboy who proved her wrong. Because love does not ask how old you are. It asks only this: will you be brave enough to answer? If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.